Have you ever walked into your chicken coop on a bright Saturday morning, basket in hand, expecting to collect enough fresh eggs for breakfast, only to find almost nothing? Perhaps one lonely egg rests in the straw, while the hens look tired, their feathers appear dull, and the coop carries that sharp, dusty smell of ammonia. Then your attention turns to the cost. Bag after bag of starter feed, layer pellets, scratch grain, oyster shell, and vitamin supplements keeps draining your budget, yet the number of eggs hardly improves. For a flock of only 20 laying hens, commercial feed can easily cost between $600 and $750 a year. When grain prices rise or supply chains become unstable, that expense can climb even higher. At that point, many keepers begin asking a difficult question. Are we truly raising chickens, or are we maintaining an expensive system that constantly demands more money while giving us less in return? Most people did not begin homesteading because they wanted to depend completely on the nearest feed store. But there is another way, one that does not require stacking bags of commercial ration in the shed or spending every weekend scraping manure from wooden roosts. Generations ago, farmers in Japan and other parts of East Asia developed practical closed-loop systems that connected chickens, household waste, garden plants, insects, soil, and bedding. By using resources already available around the home and farm, they were able to keep healthy, productive hens and produce rich, flavorful eggs with deep yellow yolks, while greatly reducing, and in some cases eliminating, the need to purchase commercial feed. So how could such a system work? Was it some forgotten secret, or simply sound biology applied carefully and consistently over many generations? Today on Farmyard Care, we are going to break this method down step by step. We will examine 5 dependable feed streams, a living bedding system that helps process manure, and an ecological design that turns ordinary waste into valuable resources. Together, these methods can help you lower feed costs, improve flock health, reduce daily labor, and build a more self-reliant chicken-keeping system starting in your own backyard. Part 1. The Osaka Miracle of 1947. Our story begins among the ruins of Osaka, Japan, in 1947. The country was struggling to recover from the destruction of World War II. Food was desperately scarce, agricultural production had fallen by around 40%, and rice output had dropped to only 58% of its pre-war level. Malnutrition was spreading through the cities, and every available grain was considered far too valuable to be used as animal feed. According to conventional Western economic thinking, small household poultry flocks should have disappeared completely. Yet when American agricultural inspectors visited small farms outside Osaka, they recorded something they could hardly explain. Inside modest backyard coops, they found native hens being raised without purchased commercial grain. Instead, the birds survived on resources available close to home: kitchen leftovers, rice milling byproducts, and wilted vegetable scraps soaked in wooden buckets of water. Despite these severe limitations, the reported production reached an astonishing 280 eggs per hen each year. Think about that for a moment. During one of the harshest periods of food scarcity in modern history, these backyard chickens were reportedly producing 43% more eggs than American commercial poultry operations of the same period. The inspectors carefully documented what they observed. The figures were written down, submitted, and eventually forgotten. By 1950, post-war reconstruction programs and large-scale grain imports were reshaping Japan's food system. A self-reliant method that required no regular feed purchases, freight ships, or international supply chains did not fit easily into the emerging industrial model. The Western world increasingly moved toward packaged feed. Convenience replaced local resilience, and over time, many of the biological practices that supported those post-war flocks faded from common knowledge. But the principles behind them never disappeared. Today, when feed prices can rise sharply within only a few months, those old systems deserve our attention once again. So how did Japanese households turn ordinary food waste and local byproducts into a nourishing diet capable of supporting productive hens? Much of the answer begins with one simple but often overlooked practice: external fermentation. Part 2. Fukuoka's Do-Nothing Revolution. To understand how a natural farming system truly works, we need to visit the citrus orchards of Ehime on Japan's island of Shikoku. This is where we encounter Masanobu Fukuoka, the respected farmer, microbiologist, and pioneer of what he called Shizen Noho, natural farming, often translated as do-nothing farming. But doing nothing never meant laziness, neglect, or abandoning responsibility. Fukuoka was asking a much deeper question. Instead of constantly asking what else we should add, what if we first considered what unnecessary work we could stop doing? Rather than fighting natural processes with more machinery, chemicals, and labor, could we design the farm so that plants, animals, soil organisms, and insects performed much of the work together? On Fukuoka's 10-acre orchard, chickens were not confined permanently inside bare, dusty runs. They moved freely beneath the trees through a diverse landscape filled with white clover, hairy vetch, daikon, comfrey, grasses, fallen fruit, and insects. Fukuoka understood that a chicken is not merely an animal that consumes feed. Within a properly designed farm, it becomes an active ecological worker. Throughout the day, his birds searched for insects, termites, grubs, seeds, and plant material. While feeding themselves, they also completed several important jobs. First, they patrolled the orchard for pests, eating beetles, weevils, larvae, and other insects before those pests could seriously damage the fruit trees. Second, they pecked at wood-boring insects hiding around the wooden posts and structures in the orchard, helping protect the farm's buildings. Third, their constant scratching loosened the soil surface, mixed organic matter into the ground, and placed nitrogen-rich manure exactly where the trees could use it. When evening came, Fukuoka called the chickens back to their shelters. He did not provide a large meal of commercial grain. Instead, he offered only a small handful of scraps. That food was not intended to supply their entire nutritional requirement. Its main purpose was to establish a reliable routine so the birds would return before dark and remain protected from predators. By trusting the chickens' natural instincts and placing them inside a biologically diverse orchard, Fukuoka demonstrated how a flock could gather much of its own food while helping regenerate the land around it. His lesson went far beyond poultry. He believed the purpose of farming was not simply to produce crops, fruit, or eggs. Farming should also teach people to observe more carefully, interfere less blindly, and understand their place within nature. But how can we apply this kind of resilience in an ordinary backyard, especially when land is limited? To answer that question, we need to examine another remarkable Japanese farm, one where a devastating poultry health crisis eventually led to a completely different way of raising chickens. Part 3. Recreating the Banana Field, the Miyagi Farm Story. In 1980, on the subtropical island of Okinawa, a young poultry farmer named Kenji Miyagi faced a crisis that threatened his entire operation. He and his brother had recently placed 25,000 chicks inside a modern facility designed according to the accepted poultry standards of the time. Almost immediately, something went terribly wrong. Every day, between 100 and 200 chicks were dying. Veterinary testing identified infections involving E. coli and Staphylococcus aureus. Miyagi had studied animal feed science, so he responded exactly as the modern textbooks recommended. He disinfected the facility twice each day and treated the birds with strong antibiotics. At first, the approach appeared successful, and the deaths stopped. Within 3 years, however, the bacteria became resistant. Miyagi changed to a stronger antibiotic, which remained effective for another 3 years. When that treatment failed, he moved to a third drug, but this time the protection lasted only about 1 year. The chicks became pale, weak, featherless, and severely anemic. Their condition continued to deteriorate despite the cleanliness of the cages and the intensity of the treatments. Overwhelmed by the number of dying birds, Miyagi carried some of the weakest chicks out of the sterile facility and placed them overnight in a wild banana grove. He expected none of them to survive until morning. But when he returned the next day, he saw something he never expected. Chicks that had barely survived inside the modern cages were standing. They appeared alert, active, and noticeably stronger. Without further disinfectants, imported feed, or synthetic medicine, some of the birds seemed to be recovering. Miyagi was determined to discover what had changed. When he examined the digestive tracts of several recovered birds, he did not find concentrated, high-protein commercial feed. Instead, he found wild grasses, native soil, and decomposing forest leaves. That discovery became the turning point for Miyagi Farm. Miyagi began to suspect that a completely sterile cage environment was weakening the bird's internal biological balance. Rather than relying only on chemicals, he decided to recreate some of the conditions found in the banana grove inside the poultry house. He introduced mountain soil, fallen leaves, and fermented forest humus. He supplemented the system with crushed oyster shell for calcium, along with mugwort, seaweed powder, and wood vinegar. Because wild grasses and fibrous plant materials can be difficult for chickens to digest, he also developed a fermented inoculant containing lactic acid bacteria, native yeasts, and photosynthetic bacteria. Over time, Miyagi Farm expanded this biological approach. Today, the farm is known for raising thousands of chickens on deep, living bedding designed to resemble a forest floor. The litter layer is roughly 50 centimeters deep and is managed as an active composting environment, rather than discarded as ordinary waste. According to the farm's account, some bedding areas have remained in continuous use for more than 20 years. When moisture, carbon, ventilation, and animal density are managed correctly, the system can greatly reduce odor, flies, and disease pressure. But creating healthy bedding is only half of the system. The next question is even more important. Where does the daily food come from? To understand that, we need to examine the 5 practical feed streams that can be adapted to a backyard flock. Part 4. Feed Streams 1 and 2. Kitchen Resources and Fermented Liquid Gold. The first and most accessible feed stream begins in your kitchen. Chickens are omnivores, and a healthy flock naturally seeks variety. Vegetable peelings, melon rinds, cabbage leaves, stale whole grain bread, suitable cooked leftovers, and small amounts of fish trimmings can all provide useful nutrients when they are fresh, clean, and offered as part of a balanced diet. In traditional Japanese households, even the preparation of white rice could produce something valuable for the chickens. When raw rice is washed before cooking, the cloudy water is often poured down the drain, yet this liquid contains suspended starch and small amounts of nutrients from the surface of the grain. Some farmers collected it for immediate use or added it to mixtures of bran and kitchen scraps during fermentation. However, a bucket of raw scraps alone is not a complete feeding system. To make these materials more useful and easier to manage, farmers often combine them with the second feed stream, fermented grain byproducts, especially rice bran, known in Japan as nuka. Rice bran is produced during rice milling. It contains protein, fats, fiber, minerals, and several B vitamins. Like many grain materials, however, it also contains phytic acid, a compound that can reduce the availability of certain minerals. To improve the mixture, farmers combine rice bran or wheat bran with selected kitchen scraps and enough water to create a moist but not soupy texture. The material is then packed into a covered or airtight container and allowed to ferment for approximately 3 to 5 days. As lactic acid bacteria become active, they lower the pH, begin breaking down some of the carbohydrates, and help preserve the mixture. Fermentation may also reduce part of the phytic acid and make some nutrients easier for the birds to use. The final feed should smell pleasantly sour, similar to yogurt, pickles, or fermented grain. It should never smell rotten, putrid, or strongly rancid. Any batch showing unusual colors, heavy mold growth, or a foul odor should be discarded rather than fed. Some natural farmers, including Shinji Hashimoto, took this approach further by collecting surplus milk, yogurt, and cheese from nearby dairy producers. These materials were placed in a large outdoor container and allowed to sour under controlled conditions. As yeasts and lactic acid bacteria developed, the mixture became acidic and probiotic-rich. The fermenting material also attracted insects, giving the chickens access to an additional source of animal protein. By combining carefully selected kitchen leftovers with local milling byproducts, some farmers were able to replace a substantial portion of purchased feed, sometimes estimated at 30 to 50% of the flock's daily ration. That does not mean every household scrap is safe. Chickens should not be used as a disposal system for anything that happens to come out of the kitchen. Avoid chocolate, avocado, raw green potato, spoiled food, heavily salted leftovers, and anything covered in mold. Onions should be limited rather than used as a regular feed ingredient. Apple flesh can be offered, but removing the seeds is a sensible precaution. The goal is not simply to feed waste. The goal is to convert clean, appropriate byproducts into a safe and useful part of a varied poultry diet. Part 5. Feed Stream 3. Garden Rotation and the Living Feed. Garden, the third feed stream, continues producing food while you are busy with other work. It is known as garden rotation. Instead of keeping chickens permanently inside one barren dirt run, natural farmers divide the garden or orchard into separate sections. The flock is then moved from one area to another using temporary fencing, movable pens, or a chicken tractor. Depending on flock size, plant cover, soil condition, and available space, the birds may remain in each section for 1 or 2 weeks before being moved. Inside each new garden bed, the chickens perform 5 valuable jobs. They clean up suitable crop residues, damaged vegetables, and fallen fruit. They scratch through the upper layer of soil, loosening compacted surfaces and mixing in organic matter. They consume many weed seeds before those seeds have an opportunity to germinate. They hunt for wireworms, beetle larvae, grubs, and other small pests hiding in the soil. And as they move, they deposit nitrogen-rich manure directly onto the ground. Rotation is important because chickens can quickly strip vegetation and overload a small area with manure. Moving them before the soil becomes bare allows each section time to rest, recover, and regrow. Farmers can improve the system by planting nutritious cover crops such as white clover, alfalfa, and buckwheat in vacant sections. While the chickens forage elsewhere, those plants rebuild ground cover and produce fresh leaves, seeds, flowers, and insect habitat. When the flock returns, the area has become a living buffet. A more permanent option is to establish a living feed garden around the chicken run. Mulberry is one of the most useful trees for this purpose. In favorable conditions, it grows quickly and produces large amounts of fruit. From early through late summer, ripe berries fall naturally into the run, where chickens eagerly consume them. The fruit supplies moisture, natural sugars, antioxidants, and plant nutrients. Mulberry leaves are also valuable and may contain around 14% protein, depending on the variety, growing conditions, and stage of harvest. Pruned branches can be placed inside the run so the birds can strip the fresh leaves. Comfrey is another useful plant to grow nearby. Its deep root system allows it to access nutrients below the reach of many shallow-rooted crops. Once established, it can be cut several times during the growing season and usually regrows quickly. Comfrey leaves contain protein, calcium, and other minerals, but they should be treated as a supplementary green feed rather than the flock's main ration. The leaves can be chopped and mixed in modest amounts with other forage or fermented bran. Other useful plants include amaranth and Siberian pea shrub, provided they are suitable for your local climate and managed correctly. By planting mulberry, comfrey, amaranth, and perennial shrubs around the coop, you create a feed-producing landscape instead of an empty enclosure. These plants provide shade, fallen fruit, leaves, seeds, insects, and additional organic matter year after year. Rather than planting annual feed crops from the beginning every season, you establish a perennial system once, manage it carefully, and continue harvesting from it for many years. Part 6. Feed Streams 4 and 5. The Biological Powerhouses. Black soldier fly larvae and worm farms. Now we come to 2 of the most productive protein systems in a natural poultry setup. When managed correctly, they can replace a meaningful portion of expensive soybean-based feed while turning household and garden waste into valuable nutrition. Let us begin with Feed Stream 4. Black soldier fly larvae, often called BSFL. The black soldier fly is a generally harmless insect found in many warm climates. The adults do not behave like common houseflies, rarely enter homes, and do not bite. Their short adult life is mainly devoted to reproduction. The real value of this insect lies in its larval stage, when it becomes an extremely efficient converter of organic material. Black soldier fly larvae can process many types of food waste, including meat scraps, dairy residues, citrus, onions, and spoiled leftovers that should not be fed directly to chickens. Under suitable temperature, moisture, and stocking conditions, they can reduce the volume of organic waste very quickly. As the larvae feed, they convert those discarded materials into nutrient-rich body mass. Dried black soldier fly larvae may contain roughly 40% protein and a high level of fat, although the exact composition depends on what they are fed. They also contain useful minerals, including calcium, making them a valuable supplementary feed for laying hens. One of the most impressive features of this system is that mature larvae can harvest themselves. When they are ready to pupate, they naturally leave the moist feeding material and search for a dry, sheltered location. By building a simple container with a ramp angled at approximately 30 to 40 degrees, you can guide the mature larvae upward. They crawl along the ramp, pass through an opening, and fall into a collection bucket or directly into a protected feeding area for the chickens. This greatly reduces the need for manual sorting. Once the system is properly established, the insects process waste, grow, and move toward the collection point, largely through their own natural behavior. However, black soldier fly larvae should remain one part of a varied diet rather than becoming the flock's only food. A practical target is to keep them at no more than about 30% of the daily ration. Feeding excessive amounts of any high-fat ingredient can unbalance the diet, and some keepers report that very heavy use may slightly change the flavor of the eggs. For drier garden materials, we turn to Feed Stream 5, vermicomposting, or worm farming. While a black soldier fly bin can rapidly process moist, protein-rich kitchen waste, a worm bin works more slowly in a cool, shaded location. It is especially useful for handling partially decomposed leaves, shredded cardboard, soft garden residues, and selected vegetable scraps. Red wiggler worms are widely used because they reproduce quickly and thrive in rich organic bedding. On a dry matter basis, worms contain a high percentage of protein, making them a useful occasional feed for poultry. By maintaining a simple worm bin, you create a renewable source of live animal protein. As the worm population grows, you can remove a small portion of the bedding and place it in the chicken run. The hens will scratch through the material, searching for worms while expressing their natural foraging behavior. At the same time, the material left behind becomes valuable vermicompost. Worm castings improve soil structure, support microbial activity, and provide nutrients that can be returned to vegetable beds, fruit trees, and nursery plants. Moist, rapidly decomposing kitchen waste can go to the black soldier fly larvae. Drier, carbon-rich material can go to the worms. Used together, these two systems can convert a large portion of household organic waste into poultry protein and high-quality soil amendments. Part 7. Setting up the bed, the deep litter method in lab. Now that the main feed streams are in place, we need to address another essential part of flock health, the floor beneath the birds. How do some Japanese and Korean natural farmers reduce odor, manage manure, and maintain healthier coops without relying constantly on chemical disinfectants or scraping the floor every weekend? One important method is deep litter bedding, sometimes supported with lactic acid bacteria, commonly known as LAB. Instead of keeping chickens on a bare wooden or concrete floor, the goal is to create a deep, absorbent layer that behaves more like the surface of a forest. Where drainage and predator control allow, this living floor may be established directly over earth. The bedding can be made from coarse pine shavings, chopped straw, dry leaves, hemp bedding, or a balanced mixture of carbon-rich materials. Industrial hemp is highly absorbent, while coarse wood shavings help maintain airflow. Depending on the coop design and climate, the litter may range from approximately 15 to 50 centimeters deep, but deep bedding is not simply a thick pile of material left unattended. If it becomes wet, compacted, or overloaded with manure, it can quickly produce ammonia, harmful mold, and unpleasant odors. The litter must remain loose, well ventilated, and mostly dry on the surface. Some natural farmers spray diluted lactic acid bacteria onto the bedding to encourage fermentation and support a more balanced microbial environment. You do not necessarily need an expensive commercial inoculant. A simple lab culture can be prepared at home from rice washing water and milk. Begin by saving the cloudy water produced when raw rice is rinsed. Pour it into a clean jar, leaving enough empty space for airflow. Cover the opening with breathable cloth or a paper towel. Then place the jar in a shaded area for approximately 5 to 7 days. When the liquid develops a mild sour smell, strain it and combine 1 part of this rice water culture with about 10 parts fresh milk. Allow the mixture to ferment at room temperature for another 5 to 7 days. During this period, it should separate into solid curds and a yellowish liquid whey. Remove the curds carefully. The remaining whey contains the lactic acid bacteria culture. Stored in a clean, sealed container in the refrigerator, it may remain usable for an extended period, although any culture that develops mold, a rotten odor, or unusual coloration should be discarded. To apply it, dilute approximately 1 tablespoon of LAB serum in 1 gallon of fresh, unchlorinated water. Spray only a light mist across the bedding. The litter should never be soaked. As manure mixes with the carbon-rich material, microbes begin breaking down the waste. Chickens also help by scratching and turning the upper layers. When moisture, ventilation, and bedding depth are properly controlled, this process can reduce ammonia and slow the growth of odor-producing organisms. Deep litter may also generate a modest amount of biological warmth as decomposition occurs. This can improve comfort during cold weather, but it should not be treated as a guaranteed replacement for proper shelter, ventilation, dry bedding, or emergency cold protection. At Miyagi Farm, living litter systems have reportedly been maintained for many years without complete replacement. The success of such a system depends on careful management. Fresh carbon material must be added when needed. Wet areas must be corrected immediately, and stocking density must remain appropriate for the available space. As the chickens scratch through the bedding, they encounter decomposing plant matter, small insects, fungal material, and beneficial microorganisms. This activity encourages natural behavior while helping mix manure into the litter. When managed correctly, the coop floor is no longer just a surface that collects waste. It becomes an active biological system that helps process manure, control moisture, and produce valuable compost. Part 8. The Grand Integration. When we step back and examine the entire system, the real strength of Japanese natural farming becomes clear. It does not depend on one miracle ingredient or one isolated technique. Its power comes from connecting several small processes so that the output from one becomes the input for another. Let us consider the practical numbers. A flock of 20 laying hens may consume around 15 bags of commercial feed in a year, depending on bag size, breed, climate, laying rate, and access to forage. At current retail prices, that can represent several $100s annually, and may reach approximately $750 in some areas. Beyond feed, many keepers also purchase packaged bedding, fly control products, coop cleaners, mineral supplements, and compost for the garden. Each expense may appear small, but together they create a constant flow of money away from the homestead. In an integrated system, that flow begins to change. Kitchen scraps and garden trimmings are directed into fermentation buckets, black soldier fly bins, or worm farms. The insects and worms provide animal protein. Fermented bran and suitable food leftovers provide additional energy and nutrients. Rotational forage supplies greens, seeds, insects, and natural exercise. Together, these resources can replace a substantial part of purchased feed. On properties with enough land, plant diversity, food byproducts, and careful nutritional management, the commercial feed bill may fall dramatically. Complete elimination is possible only when the flock's protein, energy, vitamins, minerals, calcium, and grit requirements are consistently met from other reliable sources. At the same time, 20 productive hens may lay several thousand eggs each year. The actual total will depend on breed, age, season, health, daylight, and nutrition, but a well-managed flock can produce food worth well over $1,000 at premium retail prices. The benefits continue beyond the egg basket. Deep litter from the coop, together with worm castings and finished organic material from insect systems, can produce a large quantity of useful compost. After it has been composted and handled safely, this material can return to vegetable beds, orchards, and perennial feed gardens. The garden then produces vegetables for the household, along with leaves, fruit, seeds, insects, and crop residues for the chickens. Instead of paying to remove waste and then paying again to buy fertilizer and feed, the farm keeps those nutrients moving through the system. Nothing should leave without performing another useful job whenever possible. Today's kitchen residue becomes tomorrow's insect protein. Chicken manure becomes compost. Compost feeds the garden. The garden produces food for both the family and the flock. That is not simply cost reduction. It is a practical form of abundance built through observation, planning, and biological cooperation. That is the foundation of genuine food resilience. Conclusion: the one straw revolution in your backyard. Modern life often teaches us that self-sufficiency is complicated, expensive, and impossible without a constant supply of industrial products. We are encouraged to fill our sheds with bags of commercial feed and call that security. But true resilience is not measured only by how much we can store or purchase. It is also measured by how intelligently we connect the resources already around us. Masanobu Fukuoka believed that a revolution could begin with a single straw. He was right. This kind of change does not require hundreds of acres, heavy machinery, or a large investment. It can begin in an ordinary backyard with someone willing to observe nature more carefully and stop treating every biological process as a problem that must be controlled. It may begin with one 5-gallon bucket of fermented kitchen scraps. It may begin with a single mulberry tree planted beside the chicken run. Or it may begin by replacing a bare coop floor with a properly managed layer of living bedding. No responsible poultry keeper should expect nature to remove every difficulty. Chickens still require clean water, balanced nutrition, predator protection, disease monitoring, and daily care. But when the homestead is designed around natural cycles, much of the waste, labor, and expense can be reduced. The birds gain more opportunities to forage and express natural behavior. The soil receives organic matter and fertility. The garden becomes more productive, and the family benefits from fresh eggs and food produced closer to home. Thank you for watching Farmyard Care. If this video has changed the way you think about feeding and managing your flock, press the like button, share it with another backyard chicken keeper, and subscribe so you do not miss the next step toward practical self-reliance. Now let us know in the comments, which of these 5 feed streams would you establish first? Until next time, keep observing, keep growing, and let nature guide the system.